So I will go to today, December 12th. Show me the money. We're talking about AAC funding. And we're focused on looking at funding in a school district setting. If you're not in a school district setting, we're glad to have you here too. And we will definitely love to hear from you. And there's a lot of overlap. So, but if you hear the school conversation come up, that's where we're largely focused. So, what we are going to do is start with a little survey, kind of just to get a feel for what people are doing across the state, because we do have people from all over, possibly even out of state, joining this conversation. And what we do know is that funding AAC systems looks different across the state. And school districts have different ways of doing it. People have different comfort with funding AAC and different resources. So we're hoping that part of this conversation is sharing resources, sharing success stories, sharing barriers, and helping each other with this funding process, because we all know it's really important to get our students AAC systems when they need it. Okay, so our first question is, what type of funding have you used for AAC evaluations? And if you put other and you don't mind, I would love for you to put it in the chat. What are those other things? So I know we're all hungry for that information.
I thought of one other thing that's not listed on there too, which is
What's that?
parent providing the device and maybe not going through their private insurance. Maybe they purchased their own iPad.
Yeah, great point. Private pay. Yeah, thanks. Okay, Department of Rehab. Yep. Voc Rehab. Yeah. Do you or SLPs in your district work with families to fund AAC systems through insurance or like Medicaid? All right, so a little of each. Some people are and some people aren't.
I was just going to say there's so many like nuances to this as well, because I think I would add in the caveat for this question specifically. We're wondering, does your district fund what you as the SLP think is an appropriate solution for that
Mhm.
for your student that you're working with? So something maybe that's robust and has speech generating capabilities if that's what's needed. I also think, we can get into this conversation later, but had we asked this question of many districts even 10 years ago, definitely 15 years ago, our answers would have been very different, because that was, pre iPad with app, and funding a system meant spending $10,000 plus, right? So I think that certainly has changed the conversation a little bit as well.
Okay, we're almost done here. So how confident are you in doing AAC evals? There's a lot of things that go into this, right? Like some districts are larger, and maybe you are the person who does all the evals for students who need AAC, or you're a small district and you do that, so you're used to it. Maybe you've only had one student that you needed to do this. So many variables. And thanks for sharing in the chat. There's maybe more barriers than this, but this is kind of what we came up to as potential barriers for AAC funding, that the time to do the evaluation and paperwork, maybe limited access to AAC devices to trial, or for you to get to know as someone who's doing these evaluations, just a general lack of knowledge about AAC. Maybe this is new or while. And things change, right? Like Sarah said, technology changes quickly. Limited access or time to include the family might be a potential barriers. We want to include families, and maybe it's hard to get that time to talk with them. Limited support from administration.
I think my responses would be different depending on the type of situation. So, like if it's going to be a privately funded device, for me personally, then limited access or time to family would be a big barrier. Whereas if this is, advocating to the district and advocating to administration to purchase something, then limited support would probably be the biggest. So it could also
Mm,
just depend on the situation, each specific eval.
right. Thanks for sharing. This is our last question. What would you find helpful in the future? So what, or now, what would you find helpful in order to do AAC evaluations and provide funding for AAC devices? There was a comment in the chat. Let's see. I would like to observe evaluations by other clinicians in the district or have someone more skilled complete them. That's a great point. Observing an evaluation would be so valuable, and we rarely get opportunity to do such a thing. Someone else said opportunities to observe a few of AAC evaluations from start to finish. Same idea. Let's see what else. A place to find example letters of justification for funding paperwork. We have one resource, I think, for you there. Easy access to funding and variety of AAC devices to use and decide which one is appropriate. Definitely. Relationships with the local device company reps. Yeah, we'll give you some resources there, and then we have a few ideas. Considerations for when a team might want to explore AAC when supporting a student who uses verbal communication in most situations, but faces barriers in some circumstances. Some part-time AAC users. A guidance document about how insurance funding needs to be allowed in school districts for SLPs to give to administration that prohibits it. If you have a student who's getting an AAC eval from someone else, like they have a private therapist or they're going to a clinic or like the children's hospital to do an AAC eval, that could potentially be a great opportunity to watch, to observe.
It's mutually beneficial, you know, as the evaluator, that you're meeting that child or that person for the first time often. And so it's helpful to have more familiar people there who can share those anecdotal things that happen in your ongoing sessions and what you've observed. And then to your point too, Sarah, then you can bring it over and continue the work later. The other thing I wanted to say is, as a school district SLP, if you do work with a device vendor, you can have them come in and they can work with your student with you also. So I learned a lot in the past watching device reps come in and trial, let's say like an eye gaze device with my student. They would do those like think alouds with me so that I could see how they were calibrating it, how they were assessing, you know, where the student was looking and how it was working and all of that. So anyway, learning from the reps can be an option as well.
Across the top here, we have potential funding sources for AAC. A little bit of what does it mean? How does that work? Very general, very brief, and potential pros and cons. For instance, durable medical equipment. So like Sarah was talking about those more possibly expensive devices, things that maybe students need alternative access options for. Maybe a student has eye gaze, or most of these devices have switches, even if they have eye gaze. So, or even systems that are iOS or iPad based that are funded through insurance. So you would work with the families and their insurance. One way to go through this is, or most device manufacturers have some sort of like funding portal on their website or funding supports. And so I will show you that in a minute on the next page. This is great because sometimes these are expensive items. Also, this item is going to stay with the student. It belongs to them if this is a personally owned system. So these are a few vendors that you might hear about that are resources for funding. And like Sarah said, they can bring devices to you. You can borrow devices. I was recently talking to Sherry at the ASHA conference, and she was saying they have different device lending lengths, but up to 8 weeks sometimes, or sometimes 4 weeks. But if you're able to get a device loan from a vendor, and then you can also borrow it from us, that extends your device trial, right? Because I know 4 weeks is pretty short when you're looking at these systems and kids are sick or there's a vacation and all of that. So just be creative in how you can get systems. So we put the name of the company, some of the devices that they make. So, and then it'll have your rep for the area or sometimes just for the whole state. And then at the bottom, you can see, like I said, companies have funding portals. So aacfunding.com for PRC Saltillo. Toby has the same kind of portal, Talk to Me Technologies. So they'll talk you through it. how can I get a device? What does funding look like? What is uh what is the paperwork? They have all the paperwork there. What are the next steps? What can I expect? How do I talk to the family about this? Um, Anything else, Sarah?
Yeah, I was just going to add on that depending on which company you use, their funding portals are quite robust. And so if you're looking for examples of how to fill out the paperwork, they often do have those examples that are specific to their paperwork and their funding options. Also, just to speak to Toby Dynavox, because I've done that one more recently, they have internal people on who work in their funding department who review your paperwork also and will tell you exactly which sections you should add to or change because they've done this. So this is what they do. So they know, the types of language that helps get a device funded versus something that might be denied by an insurance company. So they will work with you along the way. There's a question in the chat. How difficult is it in Washington to get a dedicated speech generating device via insurance? That is a hard question to answer because there's so many variables. It depends, I would say, largely due to the type of insurance that the family has. If you're going through family's insurance, with Medicaid, Medicare, there's often more barriers to funding than private insurance, such as Primera or Regents or something like that.
Yeah, but it can definitely be done. And I was talking to an SLP group recently in one part of Washington, and there was a few SLPs that said, "Oh, we do it all the time. We get funded all the time." Not to make it sound easy, but it's it can happen. Does it take a long time? How long?
Again, it depends. I've seen it happen relatively quickly, which in my mind is like a few months, or it can take a really long time, like 6 months, even a year, if parts are being denied and then having to resubmit. That can extend the length of time. But I love Sarah's ideas of being creative and getting trial devices. Many of these have cloud-based ways of saving your vocabulary and programming that you do too. So even if you're, borrowing one from the company and then borrowing one from Setsi or whatever way you're doing it, you could transfer over those vocabulary files oftentimes.
Great. Another comment in the chat. I've heard from many SLPs that Talk to Me Technologies funding report template was very helpful and had most of the info needed on it. So
If you are a school-based SLP, when would you encourage a family and potentially you as the school-based SLP help do the funding paperwork to get a personally owned device versus having your district pay for a device? That's something that in my role as a school-based SLP, I thought a lot about because when a device, even if I helped write the report and get the device funded, in my role as a school-based SLP, the device is owned by the family. So I had a couple cases where the family chose not to send the device in right away because it was a very expensive piece of equipment that they just had funded. They were worried it would break or something would happen to it at school. And so then that left me as the school-based SLP feeling frustrated because I had just gone through all of that work, helped get this funded, and now we're left without the technology at school to help support the student. So there's pros and cons to every way that you do this. And I would love to hear people's thoughts on this.
there's a comment saying I've had 5 or more different SLPs write their first funding reports over the last year, and everyone has been approved on their first try. Oh. Most of our students had their device in hand within 2 to 3 months. We've had an easy time with Medicaid so far. Well, that's fun to hear. Mostly were those students that needed devices for alternative access or iOS based? Just curious.
They were mostly eye gaze, but we have had a few direct selection that have been submitted as well.
And what we ended up doing, just to like close the loop with the district that I work in, is that we were able to provide a device that was funded by the school district that met the educational need, but maybe wasn't like the gold standard of what I had wanted for the student. And while he was learning to use the equipment through private therapy, we were offering access. We were working on his access method and offering robust access to language through a partner assisted modality. So that's, a little bit different than our topic for today, but it just led to good conversations with the family and just made me think like, what should my role as a school-based SLP be if my district can provide something, but it's not, necessarily the best. Do I go that route? Do I, when and how do I work with the private therapist? And I really think it just is a case by case basis.
I think that's really interesting. I'm really glad you brought that up because I definitely could see if I were on the parent end, how that would be a little scary to send that device to school at first, but then also as the SLP, how are we meeting their language needs, their robust language needs? So so a partner assisted scanning, and can you just explain that just in case somebody is not familiar with what that would be?
Yeah, so in this case, we were using SimPod, and how that looked was SimPod is an app on an iPad, but this doesn't have to be that. It can be paper-based, but partner assisted in the way that this vocabulary was arranged in a pragmatic way. So language functions as opposed to like just core vocabulary. But the partner scans through, and depending on how they do it, there's a few different ways you can do it, would point to each symbol, and in this case was verbally saying what each one was. One time through just in that way, and then a second time through having the student identify through their confirmation response, whether that's a head nod or look up for yes, or body lifting smile, whatever that yes response is, using that as an indication that that was the selection made by the student.
Yeah, I've done something similar a long time ago, and it was kind of more of a list-based text, and it was all and we did that for a long time while we were trying to figure out what a good device would be. And then through the process of trying to get funding. School-funded devices, let's talk about this. I'm looking in the middle here. Schools are required by law to provide access to and to provide services for AAC. How I understand and interpret the law is they're not required to fund AAC unless there are no other funding sources that exist. Please correct me if I'm wrong. If you have other information, the Department of Education's Myths and Facts has come out, and it's definitely in favor of saying kids need access to AAC. If this is something they need to have it. But kind of like what Sarah's saying, there's a lot of variability in what that is. The question in the chat is to take home or to have at school. Good question. So to meet their educational needs, and that's another question for you all is, are you seeing devices funded by school going home? Do they go home over breaks? Do they go home on the weekend?
But I will say that in the district that I work for, we send devices home. But there has been question about that because, there's, with all of these things, I keep repeating the word nuance. Like there's so many gray areas and challenges where maybe a school-based device is going home and either parents or private providers reprogramming it in a way that's more restrictive and less robust, or, there's so many different things that can happen. But ideally, yes, I would say if a school-based device should go home if possible.
And now that we have a lot of districts have technology that goes home, or kids are one-to-one, they have iPads or something, there's often a district-wide liability form type thing that can be filled out. I know when I was working in a school district, we just used the same form that kids used when they were taking home other technology. And that was kind of how we justified it. This is something they need access to.
It says, we've had great luck getting families to send the funded device to school when we've started that discussion with families right at the beginning of the funding process. So it's almost an expectation to send it since the school SLP is the one doing it. Also, part of our decision on which device is selected involves a discussion about warranty from different companies. And we can choose one with better warranty if that is a concern for family to ease that fear. I love that.
Warranty to be considered on your evals, and training, right? Training needs to be part of the AAC eval. And either way, whether it's through insurance or not, having parents involved from the beginning is definitely going to be helpful. Other options, I don't think anybody responded about using grants for AAC funding in our survey, but there are certainly many grants, and I've listed the Ben's Fund here. It's for students with autism. There's an Apraxia Kids grant. The ARC of your local county may have an assistive technology grant. I know that I've worked with ARC of Snohomish County when they had their grant period, and it would spend, I think at that time it was $1,000 to, and that generally covered an iPad with an AAC app and a case. So these are things that often school-based SLPs will write with the families to support and then provide to the family. The family then seeks out the next steps. Someone mentioned DVR, vocational rehab, and then DDA has a waiver.
Hi, Sarah, this is Rose. Thanks so
Hi,
much.
Rose.
And actually, one of my colleagues, who is Peggy Dotson, is on the line. I don't know if she's handy. And Peggy is our Assistive Technology Program Manager, which is a relative role within DDA. But the exciting thing is that assistive technology through DDA can come through waiver, and it also can come through community first choice. One of the places it gets a little sticky is that DDA rules also say that other funding sources have to be looked at first. So this is something we're really going to try to get clarity on that. I was curious when we're looking at the funding question from the school piece, I was looking at the section of the rules that talks about methods of ensuring services. I'm just wondering if we're looking at the same one on that, because it does talk about a school could look towards other resources if they might be responsible, and then otherwise have it. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's kind of similar wording, right?
Yep.
Anything you wanted to share on that, Peggy?
Yeah, I think Rose summed it up. Yeah, we're still trying to figure things out, but you know, if a client is a school-age student and they have a DDA waiver or on a waiver or have community first choice CFC, they do have funding. But you know, at the same time, the rule is that we have to access all other optional funding first. So that would include Medicaid, like if the client's on, you know, Apple Health, including the school. So yeah, thank you.
And this is Rose. Can I just add one other thing that it's encouraging, exciting to hear, Leslie, about the team success that you're having. One of the things I've learned since I joined DDA is that if a student does end up accessing a DDA waiver, that means they're Medicaid eligible. So that potentially also opens up that insurance, Medicaid insurance through that child-specific device piece. But yeah.
If a family is wanting to learn about whether DDA is a resource for assistive technology, what would be their next steps?
If they're already enrolled, if their child is already enrolled as a client, they could ask their case manager. If not, they could, I can put the link in the chat for information that they can seek about referral or information and services regarding becoming a client. I'll find that and put that in here.
Thank you. And we can add that to our resources page. I believe the same is true with DVR. If your student is already a client and they have a case manager, and then they would talk to the case manager.
I have a DDA question, maybe. I know since the other options have to be considered first, one thing that a lot of school districts in our area have been facing lately has been their levies coming up, technology levies, which often pay for things, and ours barely squeaked by, but looked like it was going to fail for quite a while. Would something like that be if we were to lose levy funding and not be able to have it in the schools? Is that something we could go to DDA for instead for our students afterwards, or would that not count?
You know, Leslie, this is Rose. I think that's a really good question. I'll tell you just totally transparently, what I'm hoping to do in the next year is kind of see if we can just get more clarity on that. Because because it's, when we look at the rules, it says, you should be able to go, if there's another source, go look at it. If not, we got to provide it. And then our rules say the opposite. So we're hoping to get clarification, especially because there's so much interest in building momentum to get AAC devices to more kids who need them. So we want to figure out how we get there. Yeah, because at this stage, we kind of look at what are the entitlements that students have, and DDA for the most part is not an entitlement so much as it is an optional service, while free appropriate public education, of course, is the entitlement. So anyway, that's a long way of saying I don't have a specific clear answer, but I'm on the hunt for a good, clear answer for that.
Yeah, we just want to continue this conversation too, and we're looking and thinking about meeting with other stakeholders and people in school districts, administration, just kind of listening and learning more and see if we can keep working through on this. If you are interested in learning a little bit more, you can visit the NWAC's web. There's lots of scholarships and grants listed here, so there's a wealth of information. There's also a recording that Marcy Rivelli did from an education night that they had that I went to, and she talks about the funding process as well. So that's worth a look. Have you guys seen this? Because it just kind of goes through a lot of myths and facts, not just about AAC funding or AAC in general, but so here, providing AT services is optional. And the district doesn't have to provide AT services if there are no funds available. While IEP teams must consider AT devices and services for all children with IEPs, must provide and fully fund AT services if the IEP team determines they're necessary for FAPE. So that's different than what I had in the document. But again, what Rose was mentioning, there's a bit of variability still, I think, in these. So
Because I was on the hunt for information about whether or not schools are legally obligated to provide AT, and in this case, AAC, outside of the school day. And on page 11 of the PDF, which is like page 7 in the document, I think, it's myth 11. And the fact is that a learner's AT device should be used across all environments to both improve the child's use of the AT as well as to ensure the child is provided their required support throughout the day. And then they have a paragraph explaining that below. And what it says is that the device, and this is saying LEA, in this case, the school purchased AT may be used at home or other locations if the IEP team determines their use is necessary to provide FAPE, free and appropriate public education, to the child. So that says to me that maybe if the team decides that it is not necessary outside of the school context for the child to access their educational environment, they can make that argument that they don't need to send it home. But they're also saying that that the device could be utilized during non-academic times like counseling services, athletics, transportation, health services, recreational activities, special interest groups, or clubs sponsored by the school. So I think it really is a team-based decision. And this is saying that the device is required in all the contexts that would support a free and appropriate education for the child. That's my interpretation of it.
This is Rose too. That one's definitely come up for us too, and really helped emphasize just like the foundational nature of communication to being able to learn, right? Thinking about you do reading. One of the other myths there that feels like it might be relevant to our earlier conversation today is myth 18, because it talks about, and this is where it kind of goes in, like at the end of the day, if the AT is necessary for learning, it talks about if there's a child has their own device, they can bring it, that's great. But then if it gets broken or they don't bring it, it sounds like, Sarah, like you were saying, in that situation, the school found you figured out a way to make sure that they had access at school.
thanks, Rose. Yeah.
So on January 9th will be our next meeting, and it is Breaking Barriers, Integrating AAC and Inclusive Classrooms. Ooh, that's going to be a good one. I'm excited to talk about that.
Perfect. And our January newsletter is the same topic. So this will be fun.